The H200i is one of the largest Mini-ITX cases we've reviewed thus far. It's roughly the same depth and height as the Micro-ATX Corsair 280X, but a few centimeters slimmer. As we mentioned in the past, making a large SFF case fudges the numbers a bit, since it automatically makes airflow better and installation easier while defeating the whole purpose of a small form factor case. People generally build mATX because they want a small PC. So at 26.1 liters, the H200i has an uphill battle to fight against truly tiny cases like the 11.5 liter SG13 or 14 liter RV03. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's high-end thermal paste and liquid metal. Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut is an affordable, high-quality thermal compound that doesn't face some of the aging limitations of other pastes on the market. Cryonaut has a thermal conductivity of 12.5 watts per meter Kelvin, focuses on endurance, is easy to spread, and isn't electrically conductive, making it safe to use on GPU dies. Thermal Grizzly also makes Conductonaut liquid metal, which we've used to drop 20 degrees off some temperatures in our delidded tests. Buy a tube at the link in the description below. And this is NZXT's H200i, or H200. After this case originally came out, and after the H700i came out, NZXT did eventually remove the I suffix for some of their cases, which all it is the same exact thing, except without the smart device. The smart device adds $40 to MSRP for this case, so having that I suffix, H200i, is $130 versus $90 for it without the smart device. In general, we are almost always going to default to the no smart device solution just because the value proposition in general is so much better from that standpoint. We've heard that NZXT has improved their smart device from what they've told us. We haven't yet retested it since the H700i, but what we're mainly doing here today is looking at this from the standpoint of an $80 or $90 case rather than a $130+ case with the smart device. So, with that in mind, it's got a lot of competition at a similar price point. The main thing though, as with all ITX cases, is that it's a very unique setup. So, with ITX, it's a bit different than ATX in that there are so many different ways to build it because it really only has to be so small to fit an ITX board, and then the vendors just kind of do whatever they want after that. This case has support for one of the tallest tower coolers that an ITX case we reviewed supports. So it's not fully small form factor. It's technically Mini-ITX in that it fits Mini-ITX solely, but it is a larger case overall. Now, some people want that. If you want it, NZXT's making it for you. It's more similar to something like the Manta or the 280X or even the 011, just a smaller version of it, than it is something like the SG13 or Taku or RVZ03 or something like that that's more properly ITX. But that's okay. There are no hard and fast rules for what companies have to do. It's really up to what you think fits for your build. Just know that this is one of the larger ones we're working with, and that carries with it some important notes. So for ITX testing, we'll have thermals as always, noise as always. The problem though with ITX is that it's not perfectly scientific, so we can only do so much to control for the environment. Typically, with a case like this, you'd put on a bigger cooler. This one also supports radiators that some of the other ITX cases don't. So you can do a top mount or a rear mount radiator, and that would, of course, give you better cooling power than what we have on here, which is a downdraft cooler, spec'd for a properly ITX or small form factor case. And the point is that thermals for this, it would be much better if we were to change the cooler. But we're trying to control somewhat for testing. Just know that you can do a bit better if you wanted to for your own thermals. Anyway, as far as the cooling setup, this case is very interesting for one main reason. The H700 and H500 cases from NZXT, not to be confused with Cooler Master's H500, had a similar perforated front panel on the sides. They also opted for this exhaust setup, so it's a negative pressure setup. There is no direct intake forced in through a fan. It's all being pulled in just through a pressure system because the fan on the back and the top are both exhausting air, which means that air will find its way in through any crack that it can. And what that means is that, very interestingly, the GPU ends up particularly cool in the NZXT H500 and even H200 cases you'll see in our thermals today. The reason for that, as we'll show you in a bit, is because, as this is negative pressure, it's pulling air in through these perforated holes in the front, it's pulling air in through the bottom, and especially the bottom where the power supply mounts. We use an SFX power supply. It's smaller. This case supports ATX power supplies if you want it. Because it's SFX, we actually get significant thermal benefit for the GPU, which is actually really fun data to look at, even if you're not planning to build ITX. We'll be talking about that today. But first, let's go through some of Patrick's build notes for the case, and then we'll get to the thermals. Material quality on the H200 is high, as usual with NZXT's current series of cases. Visually, the H200i is similar to the H700i, but some aspects are closer to the H500. The steel side panel has no push button. There are two 120mm fans set up in an exhaust configuration, and the top of the case is flat except for a single fan mount. The cable management bar is back and is appreciated, as is the fact that it's easily removable with two screws. We mildly criticized the shape of the bar in the H700i, but it's less obtrusive and conforms better to cable placement in the H200i, or H200, something we also complimented in the H500. Installing and connecting the motherboard was tricky. The H200i looks like a scaled down version of the H-series design, rather than a case built from the ground up for Mini-ITX. Not all aspects of its larger counterparts adapt cleanly to ITX boards, which are more varied than ATX. For example, our board has SATA and power plugs along the top edge. There's a gap above the motherboard for routing cables, but it's blocked by the stock fan at the top of the case. This is one advantage of the popular Mini-ITX cube design. Laying the motherboard flat on top of the power supply means that all the cables can easily and cleanly reach all plugs regardless of layout. The major advantage of this case's size is that it fits most full-size components. It supports a total of 4 120mm fans or 140mm fans for the two front slots. Depending on GPU length, there's ample space for a 240 radiator in the front of the case. Power supply clearance is huge, and the only dimension that's obviously cramped is clearance between the GPU and the power supply shroud, which we'll discuss in the thermal section. We've been pleased to see the trend of removable fan cages in cases recently, but the H200's removable cage is something of an enigma. Most cases with a fan cage, like the H500, are unscrewed from inside the case. In the H200i, the thumb screws for removing the cage are behind the front panel, so the whole very firmly attached front panel has to be pried off to access them. At that point, you might as well not bother taking out the cage at all, although it could still make installing a radiator easier. We'd rather see a system like the H500, where the front panel doesn't need to be removed, or a cheaper solution with no fan cage and an easily removable front panel is in place. Getting into thermal testing now. So for additional testing, like we always do, we remove the somewhat superfluous filter on the top over the exhaust fan, just as we did with the H500. The reason being that it's an exhaust fan, so you're not going to pull dust in through there. It's literally pushing dust away from it. So we removed it just to see if it impacted thermals at all. It's nice to have, though, if you decided to reverse that into an intake fan, for example. So it's good to have it, but it should be removed stock. The negative pressure setup is pretty effective in the H500, but we anticipate a different behavior here due to the size. We did a final test with the top of the power supply shroud taped off because after looking at the thermals in the GPU torture section that you'll see momentarily, we found it almost odd to the point of considering rerunning some of our tests that the GPU is performing so damn well. Because it doesn't have any intake directed straight at the video card, we thought, well, maybe it's because we're using a short card. But no, that wasn't it. And eventually what we realized is that on the bottom of the case, the SFX power supply we used is obstructing so little of this intake that a lot of the air can go around the power supply and just filter up through the perforated holes in the top of the power supply shroud. So NZXT, job well done on the perforation for the top of the power supply shroud. It actually really works here. Now, the unfortunate side is that if you did use an ATX power supply, you lose a lot of that benefit. So if possible, if any designers are listening, what we'd like to see is maybe consider a couple extra holes or extend it out a little bit more. I know you've got these rails here. If you can maybe get rid of an inch of them, or if you can't, put some holes along the sides of them, that would give just a little bit extra breathing room for the video card to naturally pull in through pressure systems the air that it needs. It's very interesting performance though, and shows how pressure systems work in cases. So as always, ITX testing is hard to do in any perfect fashion. We've controlled for our variables, but you can put a much bigger cooler in here. So keep that in mind. Either way, let's go through the numbers as it compares to other cases on our bench. Average CPU temperature for torture tests was 63.4 degrees above ambient during our primary torture test, and that's with both case fans set up as exhaust, the default configuration. Removing the top filter didn't help, and there wasn't a significant difference in temperature, 64.2 degrees Celsius over ambient. Moving one of the exhaust fans to the upper front slot of the case for a straight front to back airflow pattern did a bit more, and delta T over ambient dropped to 60.1 degrees Celsius. There are two front fan slots, so the intake fan was recycling some air through the empty slot. Taping the power supply shroud raised DT about 1 degree to 64.5, but it seems the CPU doesn't heavily depend on air coming from the bottom of the case. At first, we thought it might be somewhat odd that the top filter would have no effect on our test bench for the H200 when it did have effect for the H500, but keep a few things in mind. One of them, the test components are completely different, so that changes everything, especially because we're using a tower cooler in our ATX test and a downdraft cooler for this one. Secondly, and also somewhat interesting, the two cases, the H500 and the H200, have very different volumes, and the significantly larger volume of the H500 means that the airflow patterns and the pressure patterns are different as they form in the two cases. So the same sized fans moving the same amount of air through a smaller space has a more dramatic effect, to the extent that something like a filter won't bottleneck us in quite the same way as we saw with the H500. Compared to other mATX cases, CPU delta T is around the middle of the pack between the stock SG13 and SG13 with the filter removed. We currently use a low-profile 47mm tall Cryorig C7 cooler for mATX testing, but the H200i has 165mm of clearance, which is huge. This is the first batch of small form factor testing, and it's taught us that there are plenty of cases out there for ITX that are built with normal tower coolers in mind, like the Core V1, the 280X, and this one. It's really not fair to judge the cooling potential of these cases based on an SFF cooler, so we're already considering revisions for our next batch of testing, but we're going to go through a couple more cases with this one just to see what else we can learn before we do our next iteration. Next up, torture GPU temperatures are next. GPU DT was 47.6 degrees over ambient during this torture test, with a similarly negligible change resulting from removing the top filter. Front intake made temperature a little worse since it set up an airflow path that would only affect the CPU. Choosing to move that fan to the bottom front slot rather than the top front slot would benefit the GPU more, but at the expense of increasing CPU temperatures. Taping over the power supply shroud had a huge impact, raising DT nearly 15 degrees to 62.2 degrees Celsius. It seems that the heavy perforation of the PSU shroud, combined with our tiny PSU, allows cool air to travel through the bottom of the case, around the power supply, and into the GPU cooler. This is important because putting an ATX power supply in this case would have roughly the same effect, albeit less extreme. We recommended using a small form factor power supply in this case earlier and would stick with it now. For NZXT, it almost might have made more sense to give up ATX power supply support compatibility entirely and just shrink the shroud instead. In the stock torture test, 47.6 DT compares very favorably with the rest of our tested cases. The RVZ03 with optimal fan placement is the only one that is able to beat the H200. Taping the shroud shut made it perform worse than the rest of the chart, except the Cryorig Taku. This can be a case with surprisingly good GPU cooling as long as a small power supply is used and it's understood that cool air needs to enter the bottom of the case. Average GPU temperature during the 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme test was 48.7 degrees, just slightly warmer than the torture test. This is the lowest stock DT we've gotten in the 3D Mark portion of our test. CPU DT during Blender CPU rendering was 43.7 degrees, respectively low. The airflow path goes directly from the GPU past the CPU cooler, so when the GPU isn't generating any heat, CPU temperatures are more competitive. During the GPU render, GPU DT was 30.7 degrees. As in the 3D Mark test, that's lower than anything else on the chart for the same reasons. VRM temperatures scale pretty evenly with CPU temperatures, and the H200i didn't change that. 44.1 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient during torture testing is warmer than the open air test we did with the Taku's drawer open, but cooler than the SG13. And we enter the conclusion, as always for these case reviews. The only motherboard form factor that will fit into this case is my Mini-ITX, although it is roughly the size of Micro-ATX. So that's a consideration, and that means that like Corsair's 280X, which is a Micro-ATX case, we find ourselves in a position where we're saying, you know what, if this is exactly what you want, we do like the build quality. The thermals are mostly fine and can be better if you just buy components that fit the giant compatibility support for CPU coolers. So it's okay. There's not, at $90 too, it's fine. We wouldn't recommend the I version. Still, yes, we know NZXT say they've improved it, but ultimately $90 is actually a pretty good value. And going over that is entering into territory where we're approaching the really kind of higher end ITX cases, almost the boutique cases. So if you want exactly this size, it's fine. We wouldn't feel any buyer's remorse buying this one for a build that specifically wants this. If you're looking for more proper ITX, that's where we'd say, obviously, hard pass. It's so big, this case, that, I mean, I think I still have the Raven on the floor behind me. Allow me to demonstrate the size difference here. This is the RBZ03. It fits the same parts as this case for our test bench. However, the NZXT one clearly will fit a much wider CPU tower cooler, and it's got more radiator support. So if those are things that you need, well, you can't use this case. If you don't need them, this case is like probably a little under half the size. So that's something to consider. But we do like the H200 for its build quality. Its thermal performance is pretty good. Part of it almost cheating because it's so large, but notwithstanding, it is doing well. And build quality is good. So the next thing we'd say is, you know what, if this is just the size you're looking for, maybe consider Micro-ATX or something. And NZXT has options there too. The H500 is not that much bigger, and we did actually like that case, and it's cheaper, $70. So if you're okay with going a couple steps up in size to maybe like here instead of here, then consider NZXT's other options or other options on the market in general. If you want ITX and you want a normal tower box, I guess this one's fine. So that's what it comes down to. Not the most exciting conclusion, but that's a good thing here because it means that the product wasn't horrendously offensive like a lot of the other stuff we looked at last year. And I want to say here, cases we've looked at so far this year overall have been actually pretty damn good. So really exciting to see that, see the industry moving in a direction that is clearly iterating on their previous designs, improving in a lot of ways. So we're seeing that overall, and just the non-I version is a pretty good deal. It's just, you know, the size thing. So consider that. As always, store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our shirts like this one. This is the Graph logo shirt I'm wearing. We have a lot of them in tri-blend available. Super comfortable shirt. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. It helps out there and get access to our Discord. Subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.